They wouldn't even step into her shadow, and by sundown, one man removed his hat, and the silence broke differently. The sun hung low over Dry Creek, turning every grain of dust into drifting gold, and in the middle of the square stood a girl no one dared stand beside. Nayeli didn't move. She stood like the last post in a broken fence, straight, still, and weathered by something deeper than the wind. Her dress carried the colors of her people, though faded now, and the small turquoise pendant at her throat caught the light just enough to remind anyone looking that she came from somewhere older than this town, older than its rules. But no one was really looking. Not the way that mattered. Boots scraped across dry wood. A horse snorted somewhere off to the side. Men leaned against railings, arms folded, watching without stepping forward. They had gathered for something simple, or so they told themselves. A solution. A transaction. Something to make the discomfort go away. Sheriff Halvorsen stood near the steps of the general store, hat pulled low, voice already worn thin from repeating the same offer. "She needs a place," he said, not unkindly but not kindly either. Just practical. Someone willing to take responsibility. The word hung there. Responsibility. It sounded clean. It wasn't. A man in a gray coat chuckled under his breath. Another spat into the dirt. No one moved. Nayeli's eyes traveled across them, not pleading, not angry, just measuring, as if she had already counted how many times she'd been unseen, and decided this would be one more. A breeze passed through the square, lifting the edge of her hair, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust, and for a moment it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. "No one will take me," she said quietly. Not loud enough to challenge them, just loud enough to settle the truth into the space between them. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even defeat. It was acceptance shaped into words. Somewhere at the edge of the crowd, a chair creaked. Ethan Cole had been there long enough for the dust to settle on his boots. He stood near the hitching post, one hand resting loosely at his side, the other brushing against the brim of his hat without quite touching it. He hadn't come for this. He had come for supplies, maybe a quiet drink, maybe nothing at all. But now he couldn't quite leave. Not with the way the silence pressed in. Not with the way her words didn't echo. He watched the others first. The way they avoided her gaze. The way they shifted their weight like something unseen made them uncomfortable. He'd seen that before. Not here. Somewhere else. Long ago. His eyes drifted back to her, and that was when he noticed the pendant. Small. Turquoise. Wrapped in silver wire, worn smooth at the edges like it had been carried through years of hands and miles of road. Something tightened in his chest. Not memory, exactly. Not yet. Just a feeling that something important had just stepped into the light. The sheriff cleared his throat again, glancing around as if hoping the answer might arrive late. "Anyone?" he asked. The word fell flat. A wagon wheel creaked. A door tapped in the wind. No one answered. Nayeli lowered her gaze, not in shame, but in completion, like a story reaching its last line. And still, Ethan didn't move. Not yet. Because out here, a step meant something. A word meant more. And a man who chose wrong didn't just change his own path. He changed the way the whole town would remember him. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched long across the square. And somewhere between one breath and the next, the moment began to shift. The wind shifted just enough to carry a different sound across the square, not louder, just clearer, like something unseen had leaned in to listen, and Ethan felt it settle along his shoulders the way a storm does before it shows its teeth, slow and certain. He let his gaze drift from the pendant back to her face, studying the way she stood without leaning, without asking, as if the ground beneath her belonged to her as much as it did to anyone who had built wood and walls on top of it. And that was when he noticed the smallest thing, the way her hands were relaxed at her sides, not clenched, not trembling, just steady, like she had already made peace with whatever came next. Around them, the town did what towns always do when something does. Not fit. It turned ordinary. Men adjusted their belts. A woman pulled her shawl tighter though the air was still warm. A boy kicked at a loose board just to hear it knock. Anything to pretend this moment was not asking something from them. Sheriff Halvorsen shifted his weight, and looked down at the paper in his hand as if it might offer a different answer this time, but it did not, and when he looked back up his eyes passed over Naeli quickly, not out of cruelty but out of habit, the kind that forms when a man chooses not to see too often. "There has to be some arrangement," he said, voice softer now, almost to himself, like he was trying to smooth something rough without touching it directly. No one answered him. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt chosen. Ethan drew a slow breath, tasting dust and something older beneath it, something that reminded him of a place far from here where stories were told low and steady by firelight, where respect was not spoken, it was shown, and he felt the memory brush past him again, not clear enough to hold, just enough to make standing still feel heavier than moving. His thumb finally touched the brim of his hat, just a light pressure, enough to remind him it was there, enough to remind him what it meant, and for a moment he kept it there, not lifting it, not yet, because he knew the difference between acting and choosing, and this had to be the second. Naeli turned her head slightly then, not toward him exactly, but toward the edge where he stood, as if she felt the weight of his attention the way one feels heat from a fire, without seeing the flame, and their eyes met for the briefest moment, not long enough for questions, just long enough for recognition, not of who the other was, but of something shared, something neither of them had put into words. It was enough. A horse stamped its hoof nearby, breaking the rhythm, and a man muttered under his breath, the kind of sound meant to push a moment back into place, but it did not work this time. Ethan felt the decision settle in him, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like a door closing behind him without a sound. He stepped forward one pace, then another, boots pressing into the dust that had not yet decided whether to rise or stay, and the square seemed to notice, not all at once, but in pieces, heads turning, voices cutting off mid-thought, the kind of attention that gathers when something unexpected begins to take shape. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to see the fine lines etched by sun and wind along her skin, close enough to see that her eyes did not drop this time, and for a moment neither of them spoke because there was nothing to say that would not lessen what was about to happen. His fingers moved then, slow, deliberate, lifting the hat from his head, not as a gesture for the crowd, not as a signal to the sheriff, but toward her, and as the brim cleared his brow the last of the sunlight caught along its edge, and the square went completely still, not because they understood, but because something in them recognized that they were witnessing a line being crossed that could not be drawn again. The hat remained in Ethan's hand, held just below his chest, not lowered in surrender and not raised in pride, but balanced in that quiet space where a man shows exactly what he means without saying a word, and for a long second nothing in Dry Creek moved, not the men by the rail, not the sheriff on the step, not even the loose dust that had been drifting all afternoon as if it too had decided to wait and see what came next. Naeli did not step back. That alone was enough to change something. Her eyes held his now, steady and unflinching, not soft, not hardened, just present, and there was a difference in that presence, something that made the space between them feel less like distance and more like ground being shared. Ethan felt it, though he could not have named it if asked. He only knew that this was no longer about the crowd behind him or the rules they followed without thinking. This was about a line that had been drawn long before either of them stood here, and whether it would remain. A murmur rose at the edge of the square, low and uncertain, like a fire trying to catch in damp wood. One of the men shifted forward. Half a step, then stopped, his hand brushing his belt as if he needed something familiar to hold on to. "What are you doing, Cole?" someone called out, not loud enough to challenge, just loud enough to be heard. Ethan did not turn. The question did not belong to them anymore. Sheriff Halvorson cleared his throat again, but this time the sound carried less weight, like authority slipping through fingers that no longer closed tight enough to hold it. "This is not how it is done," he said, though even he did not seem sure who he was saying it for. Ethan's grip on the hat tightened just slightly, not in tension, but in decision, and then, slow enough for every eye to follow, he dipped his head. Not deep. Not exaggerated. Just enough. A gesture simple enough to miss if a man did not understand it, and powerful enough to unsettle anyone who did. It was not directed at the sheriff. It was not for the town. It was for her. Naeli's breath shifted, barely visible, but real, like the first movement of wind before dawn. She had seen men look at her with suspicion, with curiosity, with something colder than both, but she had not seen this. Not from someone who had nothing to gain. Her hand rose halfway, then paused, fingers hovering near the pendant at her throat, as if grounding herself in something familiar while the ground itself seemed to change. The silence deepened, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full, like a held breath that carried meaning instead of absence. Ethan straightened again, placing the hat back on his head with the same care he had used to remove it, and when he spoke his voice was low, steady, and carried just far enough. "She stands," he said. "Nothing more."
No explanation.
No defense. The words settled into the square like something that had always belonged there, but had never been spoken aloud. Sheriff Halvorsen looked from Ethan to Naeli and back again, his expression shifting through confusion, then something closer to understanding, though it came slowly, like a door opening on hinges that had not been used in years. Around them, the crowd began to adjust, not outwardly, not with grand gestures, but in small ways, a man straightening his posture, a woman lowering her gaze, a boy stepping back instead of forward, as if each of them felt the weight of what had just been placed in front of them and did not yet know where to set it down. Naeli lowered her hand, leaving the pendant where it rested, and for the first time since she had stepped into the square, her shoulders eased, not in relief, but in recognition that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and though no one had moved to stand beside her, she was no longer standing alone. The words did not echo, but they settled, and that made them heavier than any shout could have been, and for a moment the town of Dry Creek did something it had not done all afternoon. It listened, not to the sheriff, not to the crowd, but to the space that had just been cleared between two people standing on the same ground. Ethan did not move away. That was the second thing that changed. A man could make a gesture and step back into safety, let the moment belong to memory instead of consequence, but he stayed where he was, boots planted in the dust, as if he had chosen the spot and meant to keep it. Naeli noticed. Her gaze shifted slightly, not questioning, not searching, just confirming, like someone testing whether a bridge would hold before taking the next step. Around them, the small sounds of the town began to return, but they came back different, quieter, uncertain, as if each person was measuring their place again against what had just happened. The man in the gray coat straightened his shoulders and looked away first, not out of respect, but because he no longer knew where to rest his eyes. The boy near the board stopped kicking it altogether. Even the horse by the post lowered its head, the rhythm of the moment settling into something slower. Sheriff Halvorsen stepped down from the wooden stairs, one careful step at a time, his boots landing with a dull thud that seemed louder than it should have been, and when he reached the ground, he did not speak right away. He looked at Ethan, then at Naeli, and there was something in his face that had not been there before, not authority, not hesitation, something closer to realization, like a man who had followed a rule for so long he had forgotten to ask where it came from. "This town has its ways," he said finally, but the words lacked the edge they had carried earlier, and even he seemed to hear it. Ethan's eyes stayed forward. "So does the land," he answered, not raising his voice, not lowering it either, just placing it where it belonged. The reply did not challenge. It did not submit. It simply existed, and that made it harder to argue with than anything louder could have been. Naeli shifted her weight then, just slightly, the movement small enough to miss if someone was not watching closely, but Ethan saw it, the way her stance changed from holding ground to sharing it, and that was when he understood that what had begun as a line between them had become something else entirely.
A path, maybe.
Not one either of them had planned to walk, but one that had appeared all the same. A woman near the edge of the crowd adjusted her shawl again, then lowered it, her eyes lingering a second longer than before, not with suspicion, but with something closer to curiosity. Another man cleared his throat and stepped back half a pace, creating space where none had been offered before. It was not much. It was enough. The town did not change all at once. It never did. It shifted in inches, in glances, in the quiet decisions people made when they thought no one was watching. And yet, standing there in the fading light. It felt as if something larger had moved beneath all of it, something that would not settle back into its old place no matter how much they tried. Nayeli lifted her chin just a fraction, the last of the sun catching along the edge of her pendant, and for the first time there was no weight in the way she held herself. No need to prove, no need to endure, just presence, steady and undeniable. Ethan felt the change settle in his chest, not as pride, not as victory, but as something quieter, something that asked nothing and demanded everything at the same time. He did not reach for her. He did not step closer. He simply remained, and in that stillness, the distance that had once defined the moment no longer existed the way it had before. Somewhere beyond the square, a door closed softly, and the sound carried just far enough to mark the end of something unseen and the beginning of something no one in Dry Creek could yet name. The light shifted again, softer now, stretching long shadows across the wooden fronts of the buildings, and with it came a subtle change in the air, the kind that does not announce itself but settles into the bones of a place, and Dry Creek felt it whether anyone chose to admit it or not. Ethan remained where he stood, but the weight in his shoulders eased just enough to show that his choice had settled into something steady, something that no longer needed defending. Nayeli noticed that too. She had seen men act with sudden courage before, quick and bright like a spark, only to fade when the moment passed, but this was different. This was something quieter, something that did not burn out because it had not been lit for show. She turned her head slightly toward the street that led out of the square, the long road cutting through dust and distance, the same road. She had walked into this town with nothing but what she carried and what she refused to leave behind. For a brief moment, it seemed like she might walk it again, alone as before, but this time the ground beneath her did not feel the same. Sheriff Halvorsen let out a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he realizes the rules he has leaned on no longer hold the shape they once did, and he folded the paper in his hand without reading it again. "There is no claim here," he said, more to the air than to anyone in particular, as if the words needed to exist out loud for the town to hear them and decide what to do with them. No one argued. That was the third thing that changed. A man near the rail scratched his jaw and looked away, another adjusted his hat but did not meet anyone's eyes, and the woman with the shawl took a small step back, giving space that had not been given before. It was not acceptance. Not yet. But it was no longer rejection either. Nayeli's gaze returned to Ethan, and there was something different in it now. Not gratitude, not quite trust, but recognition that he had placed himself in the same uncertain space she had been standing in all along. That mattered more than anything he could have said. She took a single step forward, not toward him, but forward all the same, her boots pressing into the same dust that had carried every whisper and judgment just moments before, and the sound of it was clear, deliberate, like the first mark on a page that had been left blank too long. Ethan did not follow. He did not need to. Instead, he shifted just slightly to the side, not blocking her path, not guiding it either, simply making room where there had been none, and in that small movement there was more meaning than any declaration could hold. The pendant at her throat caught the last edge of sunlight as she moved, the turquoise glinting once, then fading as the day gave way to evening, and Ethan's eyes followed it without realizing, the shape of it pulling at something in him that had not yet found its name. The town watched, not as a crowd now, but as individuals, each carrying their own thoughts, their own quiet reckonings, and though no one spoke, the silence was no longer empty or heavy. It was changing, reshaping itself around what had just been done. Nayeli paused at the edge of the square, turning back just enough for her eyes to meet Ethan's once more, and in that look there was no question, no need for explanation, only a shared understanding that something had begun here that would not end with this moment. Ethan gave the smallest nod, not formal, not expected, just enough to answer what had not been asked, and then she turned again, stepping onto the road with a steadiness that had not been there before. The dust rose lightly around her boots, carrying the imprint of her steps into the fading light, and behind her, Dry Creek stood quieter than it had ever been, not because it had nothing to say, but because it had finally been given something worth thinking about. The road stretched ahead of her in a thin line of pale dust, fading into the horizon where the last light of day settled low and quiet, and each step Naeli took carried a different weight than the ones before. Not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, like the ground itself had decided to hold her differently. Behind her, the town did not return to its usual rhythm right away, and that silence followed her for several yards, lingering like something unfinished. Ethan remained where he had stood for a moment longer, watching the space she had left behind more than the figure moving away, as if what mattered was not the distance growing between them but the absence that had been replaced by something else. A man near the hitching post shifted his stance and finally spoke, his voice low, uncertain. "You just let her walk?" The question did not carry accusation, only confusion, the kind that comes when something does not match what a man has always believed. Ethan turned his head slightly, not fully facing him, just enough to acknowledge the words without giving them more weight than they deserved. "She was never meant to stay," he said, and that was all. No one answered after that. The sheriff remained near the steps, his hands resting at his sides now, the paper gone from his grip, and he watched the road with an expression that had softened into something quieter, something that did not need to be explained. The sun slipped lower, and the shadows stretched longer, reaching across the square and touching the edges of the buildings like slow fingers, and in that fading light, Dry Creek looked less certain of itself than it had an hour ago. Ethan finally moved, but not toward the center, not back into the crowd. Instead, he stepped away from the square, Boots carrying him along the same direction Naeli had taken, though he kept his distance, not closing the space, not calling out, just walking at his own pace, steady and unhurried. The dust rose under his steps in small clouds, then settled again, leaving no mark that could not be erased by the next wind, and yet the path felt marked all the same. Ahead, Naeli slowed just slightly, not enough to stop, but enough to notice the faint shift in the rhythm behind her, the sound of footsteps that did not belong to the town she had just left. She did not turn right away. She did not need to. The presence was enough. The road curved gently past a line of dry brush and a weathered fence that leaned more from habit than strength, and as she reached that bend, she finally turned her head, just enough to see him walking several yards behind, not catching up, not falling away, simply there. For a moment, the two of them moved in that quiet alignment, not side by side, not separate, just connected by the same direction, and the distance between them no longer felt like absence, but choice. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of open land and distant water, and it brushed past them both as if the land itself had taken notice. Naeli's hand rose again, fingers touching the pendant to her throat, and this time the gesture held something steadier, something grounded, and she let it fall back into place, without hesitation. Ethan's gaze drifted forward, following the line of the road rather than her figure, and there was a calm in his expression now, the kind that comes when a man stops asking what comes next and simply accepts the direction he has taken. Behind them, Dry Creek faded into the distance, its outline softening in the evening light, and whatever it had been before no longer held the same shape. Ahead, the land opened wide, quiet and unclaimed, and though neither of them spoke, the silence between their footsteps carried something clear enough to understand without words that what had begun in that square was not left behind. It was moving forward with them, step by step, into whatever waited beyond the horizon. The sky deepened into a quiet blue as the last of the sun slipped beneath the horizon, leaving behind a soft band of fading gold that stretched across the land, and the road ahead turned cooler in tone, its pale dust now reflecting the early rise of evening rather than the heat of day. Naeli slowed her pace again, this time not from hesitation, but from awareness, the kind that comes when a person realizes they are no longer alone in the way they once were, and she let that awareness settle without turning it into expectation. Behind her, Ethan matched the change without thinking, his steps adjusting to hers not in imitation, but in respect, as if the distance between them was something alive that needed to be honored rather than closed. The wind moved differently out here, less confined, carrying a wider breadth of the land, and it brushed past them both, stirring the dry grass along the roadside and lifting small curls of dust that faded as quickly as they rose. For a while, Neither of them spoke, and the silence felt natural, not heavy, not uncertain, just present, like a shared understanding that did not need to be named. Then, as the road dipped slightly toward a shallow creek bed that cut across the land, Naeli came to a full stop. The sound of her boots settling into stillness carried just far enough for Ethan to hear, and he stopped as well, several yards behind, keeping that same measured space between them. She turned then, not sharply, not guarded, just fully this time, her eyes meeting his in the dimming light, and for the first time since they had left the town, the moment held no crowd, no witnesses, no weight except what existed between them. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady, quiet, but clear enough to carry across the space. It was not a challenge. It was not suspicion. It was something simpler, and somehow heavier than both. Ethan did not answer right away. He let the question settle, the same way he had let the moment in the square settle before moving, because he understood that some answers could not be given quickly without losing their truth. He stepped forward then just once, closing a small part of the distance but not all of it, and the movement was deliberate, measured, like everything else he had done. "Because you were standing alone," he said. The words were plain. No explanation wrapped around them. No history offered. Just the truth as he understood it. Naeli studied him for a moment longer, her gaze searching not for something hidden, but for something missing, and when she did not find it, her shoulders eased in a way that did not show weakness, only recognition. "Many stand alone," she said softly. Ethan gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged the weight of that truth without trying to argue it. "Not all are left that way," he replied. The wind moved again, brushing past them, carrying the faint sound of water from the shallow creek ahead, and for a moment neither of them spoke, as that sound filled the space instead. Naeli turned her gaze toward the creek, the narrow line of darker earth where water still moved despite the dry season, and she took a step toward it, then another, her path no longer uncertain, just chosen. Ethan followed at the same distance, not leading, not trailing, simply remaining part of the same direction. When she reached the edge of the creek, she knelt briefly, her hand touching the surface of the water, the ripples spreading outward in soft circles that caught the dim light of the sky, and she watched them for a second before rising again. When she turned back toward the road, her eyes found Ethan's once more, and this time there was something different in them, not guarded, not questioning, but open in a way that did not ask for anything in return. He did not speak again. He did not need to. The answer had already been given, and it had been enough. Together, though still apart, they stepped back onto the road, the quiet rhythm of their footsteps falling into a shared cadence, and the night began to settle around them, not as an ending, but as a space where something new could take shape without needing to be seen. The night settled deeper, stretching wide and quiet across the open land, and the stars began to show one by one, faint at first, then steady, as if the sky itself was revealing something that had always been there but could only be seen when the noise of the day had passed. The road no longer looked like a path made by men, but something older, something that had existed before fences, before towns, before anyone thought to claim it, and as Naeli walked, her steps seemed to fall more naturally into that rhythm, as if she was no longer passing through the land, but returning to it. Ethan followed at the same measured distance, his presence no longer something separate, but something that had settled into the quiet pattern of the journey, like the sound of boots on earth or the whisper of wind through dry grass. For a long while, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them did not feel empty or uncertain. It felt full, like a conversation that did not need words to be understood. The creek they had crossed faded behind them, its soft sound replaced by the steady hush of the open plains, and the air cooled just enough to carry the scent of distant sage and something faintly sweet that drifted in from the unseen edges of the land. Naeli slowed again, this time not because she needed to think, but because something ahead had caught her attention, a small rise in the land where the ground lifted gently and the horizon widened just enough to reveal more sky than earth. She stepped toward it, her movements unhurried, deliberate, and when she reached the top, she stopped, looking out across the darkening plains where the last trace of light had now disappeared completely. Ethan came to a stop several yards behind her, the distance still there, still respected, but no longer dividing, and for a moment he simply watched the outline of her against the sky, the way she stood without tension, without weight, as if the land itself had recognized her presence and made room for it. Then, slowly, she sat down on the rise, drawing her knees in slightly, her gaze still fixed on the horizon, and the gesture was simple, but it carried something different, something that did not belong to the town, something that belonged to her. Ethan hesitated for a brief second, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect, and then he stepped forward just enough to close part of the distance, stopping a few feet away, not beside her, not behind her, just near enough to share the same view without claiming the same space. He lowered himself to the ground, his movements quiet, controlled, and as he settled, the dust beneath him shifted softly, then stilled. The night wrapped around them, not cold, not heavy, just present, and the stars above seemed brighter now, stretching across the sky in a way that made the world below feel smaller, quieter, more honest. Naeli's hand rose once more to the pendant at her throat, her fingers resting there for a moment longer than before, and then she spoke, her voice low, almost carried away by the wind. "This land remembers," she said. The words were not directed at him alone, but they reached him all the same. Ethan looked out across the plains, his eyes following the line of the horizon, and he understood what she meant, not in detail, not in story, but in feeling, the kind that does not need explanation to be true. "So do people," he replied quietly. Naeli turned her head slightly, her gaze finding him again in the dim light, and for a moment there was no distance in that look, no question, no barrier, just recognition, clear and steady. The wind moved through the grass again, a soft, endless motion that seemed to carry both their words away and hold them at the same time, and neither of them spoke after that. They did not need to. The silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence that had filled the town square. It was something deeper, something chosen, something that did not separate, but connected, and as the night stretched on, the two of them remained there on that rise, not as strangers, not as something defined, but as two people who had stepped beyond something unseen and found themselves standing on the same ground, under the same sky, without needing to claim it. The night did not rush them, and neither of them seemed in a hurry to leave it behind, as if both understood that some moments were not meant to be passed through quickly, but carried slowly until they settled into something that could last. The stars stretched wider above them now, filling the sky in quiet patterns that did not demand attention, only presence, and the land beneath held its stillness the way old places do, steady, patient, unchanged by the passing of time or people. Naeli remained seated for a while longer, her gaze moving not across the horizon now, but inward, as if the silence had given her something back that she had not realized was missing, and when she finally rose, it was without hesitation, without weight, her movement as natural as the wind shifting direction across the plains. Ethan stood a moment after her, not following immediately, not anticipating, just allowing the space between their actions to remain what it had been all along, chosen, respectful, real. The road waited where they had left it, pale against the darker earth, stretching forward into distance without promise, without certainty, and that was enough. Naeli stepped onto it first, her boots pressing into the dust with the same quiet certainty they had carried since the moment she left the town, but now there was no trace of what had been left behind in her stride, no echo of the square, no shadow of the voices that had once filled it. Only direction, only choice. Ethan followed, not beside her, not behind in distance that separated, but at a pace that no longer measured itself against hers, because the distance between them had already found its meaning and no longer needed to be defined. The wind moved again, carrying the faintest trace of something familiar, and Ethan's eyes shifted, just for a moment, to the pendant at her throat as it caught a thin line of starlight, and this time the recognition came fully, not as a feeling, not as a fragment, but as memory, quiet and complete. His mother's voice, long gone but never lost, speaking of a woman who had once given her water when there had been none, of a small turquoise stone tied with silver wire, a gift not of debt, but of respect, passed hand to hand, carried across years without promise of return. He had not known what he was looking at in the square. Not then. But he knew now. He did not speak it. He did not need to. Some things were not meant to be explained, only understood. Ahead, Nayeli slowed once more. But this time she did not stop. She simply reached up and untied the pendant from her neck, her fingers moving with care, with intention, and as she walked, she let it fall into her hand for a brief moment before turning slightly, just enough to extend it behind her without looking back. Ethan did not hesitate. He stepped forward, closing the distance for the first time not as a gesture, not as a decision, but as a continuation, and his hand met hers in that small space between them, the pendant passing from one to the other without words, without pause. It was not a gift. It was not a repayment. It was something quieter, something older, something that did not belong to either of them alone. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the smoothness worn by time, and then he tied it loosely around his wrist, not hidden, not displayed, just carried. Nayeli did not turn to see it.
She did not need to.
She knew. The road stretched ahead, unchanged, unmarked, and yet something about it felt different now, not because it had shifted, but because they had. They walked on, the rhythm of their step steady, unspoken, aligned without effort, and behind them, far beyond sight, the town of Dry Creek remained as it was, but not as it had been, holding within it a moment that would not be told loudly, would not be written down, but would remain all the same, in the way a place remembers when something true has passed through it. The night deepened, the stars held their quiet watch, and the land stretched on, wide and patient, as two figures moved across it without claiming it, without changing it, only belonging to it for as long as their steps carried them forward, and in that stillness, in that quiet, something lasting had already been decided, not by words, not by force, but by the simple choice to stand, and then to walk, without turning away.